Well, here we are with a lecture on World War One and the American response and entrance into the war. World War One perhaps is the most important event in the whole of the 20th century. And that would include, of course, the Cold War with the U.S. versus Soviets, the great space race, and everything that goes with that. It would also include the various and sundry proxy wars between the two great superpowers in the latter part of the 20th century. And it also would be fair to say, I think it's more important, in my opinion, anyways, it's more important than that what you have in World War II. I think World War II, of course, is a great and climactic event. But to me, the event that sets the stage for so much to come forward and is really the boulder into the proverbial water by which the ripples are like waves coming forth is World War One. Sure, you have some of the same combatants in both world wars. I think the effect is on a grand scale. World War One begins in 1914, ends in 1918, and World War One is going to see the creation of a more or less modern Middle Eastern map. You're going to see the wreckage of a handful of old empires. Some more creaky than others, but many of them will never be the same again if they even survive at all. The Russian Empire will collapse. The Ottoman Empire, which is Ottoman Turks, if you like, they'd been around for hundreds of years. They collapse in the afterwash, and you have the modern state of Turkey created by Kemal Mustafa Ataturk. His grand ideas put forth. The Austro-Hungarian Empire dies and collapses into nothingness, into small little states afterwards. Even the Italians are kind of going to go through their convulsions afterward, brings on Mussolini. The French nation was really never the same again after World War One, and of course the German Empire, the Kaiserreich, led by Kaiser Wilhelm II at the time of the First World War, will collapse in on itself and be replaced by a feckless and decrepit republic known as the Weimar Republic, which of course leads on to the Nazis with their ideology and everything that goes with that. One of which was is that Germany had been stabbed in the back. And the 1918, the great loss of 1918 could never happen again. Germany was too great, and so forth. Then, of course, Great Britain is, I won't say broken against the will by the First World War, but the two world wars together basically shatter the British Empire, and it's never the same again. It's not the same power it was. And of course, the rise of the American empire, the United States as a nation, is certainly going to come forward. And you see that at the beginning of American entrance in World War I. The maps of Europe are changed just on and on I can go, but you're going to see some far-flung consequences. Consequences aside from the collapse of old empires, and I mentioned the rise of new ones. I don't believe, frankly, that had the Germans lost World War I don't think you get Hitler and Hitlerism. So it is worth asking, and this is a what if and an opinion piece, but it is worth asking, was it good for the United States to have entered World War I and helped Germany to lose, knowing now what we know, looking back and saying perhaps a Kaiserreich Germany might be a better option than would be the World War II Germany. And I know what some would say is that the Germans World War I were going to be very harsh in their penalties upon the French and the British and the losers of the Entente in the First World War. And I agree, I know that. But still, at the same time, you don't have the Holocaust and you don't have all that goes with that. So, are the Second Reich Germans, the First World War Germans, clean and pure as the wind drivens? No, no, of course not. And arguably, though, they're perhaps more progressive in their social safety nets than were the British and the French. And they certainly argued that in propaganda, and it was, I would say, true. So it is worth noting. And honestly, if you get a German victory of some sort coming out of the First World War, you probably don't get the Soviets in the Communist Bolshevik Revolution. Is it good to have the Bolshevik Revolution, the Communist? Perhaps it might be fair to say, what about the 20 million or so that are killed by Stalin in his time period, or in the Soviets? We think of Hitler and his the final solution of the Nazis in Germany against the Jews and Gypsies and so on in that era, Wannsee. But the fact is that even if it wasn't as perhaps efficient and systematic as an efficient the German final solution, but the carnage was as great, or frankly greater, at the hands of the communists against Ukrainians, and on we can go. I can't see it, frankly, I can't see a difference between the communists and the Nazis. I think they're both twin bedbugs, and they're both horribly wicked and depraved. But the fact is the First World War helps bring both of them on, in my opinion, and I don't think it's hard to make that statement, hard to make that go. You had a confluence of events come together, and the coming of World War I is going to help break. It's just it has been the subject of many books, and here we are coming into, as I record this in 2018, we're coming into the 100th anniversary of the armistice, the end of the war to end all wars. There were great hopes of put to the war as it started, and there were perhaps greater hopes of everlasting peace affixed to the war after it was over. But the First World War starts in 1914, but the seeds of the First World War had been sown way before. One of those seeds was the rise of a modern Germany. Germany does not exist on a map, technically speaking, in 1800. Germany was really, we can call them Germans, and it's not improper to do so, but there is no nation or kingdom or Reich of, or an empire of Germany in 1800. You have these leftover feudal states of the old Holy Roman Empire. The most powerful and prominent of them is the Prussian state that is headquartered, or at least capitaled, in Berlin. Another prominent state would be Bavaria, and then you get the smaller ones that make up the whole of Germany. The Prussians are a very proud Germanic group. The Junker class, they particularly are the dominant class of Germany. The von, if you see with a von, that generally kind of gives away the nobility aspect of Germany. Anyways, they are going to come together, and they're going to be unified in the early 1870s under the leadership of who is probably the second most important person in all of Europe in the 19th century, and that man's name is Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck is the Iron Chancellor. That was his nickname. And Bismarck is going to be for all intents and purposes, the head of state in Germany in the late 19th century. I do realize that there is a Kaiser, or a König, König first, later Kaiser or Caesar, Wilhelm or William I, who was quite competent and quite good, who did serve and was the head of state, and he was in charge of Greater Germany. But it was Bismarck who really was the dominant force in German politics until he is cashiered in early 1905, I believe it was, by Wilhelm II, the much less able and much more feckless king or Kaiser of Germany in later World War II. But Germany had ambitions. Germany had defeated France in a fairly large war known historically as the Franco-Prussian War. They had taken property and territory from France, the Alsace-Lorraine, which is basically on the western bank plus some mileage west of the Rhine River in western Germany. Germany, at its height and power, when it is unified under Bismarck and the Kaiser, stretches from that rubbed off end in the western part of France. If you see a picture of France today, and then you look at it at the time of the First World War, you can see the northeastern point, of France has been kind of like it had been filed down by a bit of sanding paper. That is the Alsace-Lorraine, and it runs all the way eastward, all the way to East Prussia, and encompasses much of what we would call today Poland, perhaps even parts of what we'd call today would be Latvia, I believe. Point is that also you got Silesia, you got a whole bunch of territory. Germany is proud, sprawling, and seemingly coming into its own. It is an economic juggernaut. It is an economic juggernaut in the sense that the engineering marvels, many of the great works and ironworks, are found in Germany. It is an economic powerhouse that spends a good deal of its capital, a good deal of its GDP on building and maintaining and fortifying and putting together an awesome army that is not large, at least in its normal standing state, but has a large reservoir of ready reserve that can be called up at a seemingly moment's notice. It's also worth remembering, too, that Germany also not only is economically efficient, has a good army with a lot of a deep reservoir of training, and frankly, not only training, but history behind it. But it also is going to have an intricate supply and train and transportation network that helps move the troops around. And so if you wanted to fight wars, that certainly is going to be one of the things that you would need is good transportation, good logistics. You got to be able to feed the troops, get the men from A to Z, point A to point Z. You've got to give them weaponry and so on. And so Germany does that. Germany provides that and gives it a great internal set of lines of communication. The railroad is hard to underestimate its importance upon World War I. Sometimes we tend to think about all the strategies and such, and I'm going to mention the Schlieffen Plan here in a few minutes. But the fact of the matter is Germany's Schlieffen Plan was dependent upon hitting timetables and hitting specific points or access and use of the railroads and so forth. You had to have it, and they had it. Whereas, say, Russia, which has a larger army, not as well trained and not as well equipped, not as well fed, just not as good, but it was larger. But they didn't have the railroads and supplies to really organize as quickly and as efficiently as the Germans do. Germany in the 19th and early 20th century is an intellectual powerhouse. I've mentioned it before in class. If you're watching this, at least I should have anyways, is that Germany is going to have some of the finest universities, not just in engineering, that's clear, but it's also going to have some of the finest universities with regard to intellectual thinking. Theology training, some of the latest and most avant-garde understandings of philosophy, anthropology, theology, and so forth are going to be found in Germany. Many Americans, something like 10,000 over about a 90-year window from effectively I think it was 1839 to 1939, something like that. But many Americans are going to travel to Germany in an era when you did not have federally funded or publicly assisted study abroad programs. If you went abroad, you either got a local benefactor, a church perhaps, maybe a corporation. Perhaps if you're in the Army, you might have gone there too, but the reality is that you probably had some money to do it. So what I'm saying is some of your most important American leaders, later students, in the church, in the university systems, and so forth, are going to be found studying in Germany in their years of matriculation. I'd made the remark prior in classes that the modern American university system is based off of the German system. So Germany is not some sort of backwater, recalcitrant state. Arguably, it is one of the most forward-thinking and progressive states out there intellectually in the university system that they spawn and in a sense, give to others. Perhaps I've mentioned it already once, but Germany is going to also have a fairly impressive social safety net. The modern welfare state that the United States has is loosely based off of the old German state. And again, as I know, I said the Germans were proud to trumpet the fact that the Germans spent more money on old age pensions, education, and so forth, social safety nets than did the French, and the French claimed to be far more advanced. So Germany is not some sort of barbaric state. They may end up being barbaric, and certainly in the Second World War they are. But it is worth remembering, too, is that they do it with a coat and tie. So barbarism can take forms that doesn't have to just be crude knuckle dragging. It can take the form of a smile and a scalpel and cadaver, and you end up in the same place, and that is in an ash heap or a dust bin. But Germany in the 19th and early 20th century is an advanced state. And they are obviously a threat to other states in with that unified Germany, other states in on the European continent. Russia is potentially going to come into conflict, probably would come into conflict with a rising Germany, despite the fact that Tsar Nicholas and the Kaiser of Germany were both cousins, first cousins, as I recall. In addition to that, you've got to figure because they've already fought one war, and Germany arguably humiliated France in 1872 and 3, I guess, with the Franco-Prussian War, that France is going to look for a way to strike back at Germany and reclaim some of that territory and to put Germany in her place and to pin her down a little bit. It's not quite so clear that the British are going to run headlong into a war with Germany, but it's not inconceivable, because one of the things the Germans are also doing as you get toward 1900, 1910, the Germans are engaged in a naval arms race with, well, the French, the Americans, and especially the British. To be clear, it's not just Germany versus the world, but Germany is certainly a new and upcoming power that could potentially be a threat to the old European order. The old order that had held on since Napoleon's time, of those balancing acts and the spheres of influence and and so forth. So Germany, that's a new and rising power. There's no two ways about that. So you'll have between the European powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary, Russia, and so forth, France and Britain, and so on. You're going to have a series of defense measures, defense treaties that are going to be signed. And it's worth remembering when you talk about defense treaties, the thing about defense treaties is that they're only worth the paper they're written on unless you back it up. If it's just a piece of paper, you can sign defense treaties all the time. I will come to the aid of this little country in Africa, or I will come to the aid of the British, or I will come to the aid of whomever. But if that's all you have, it's a pretty thin reed to stand on, because you've got to have the will to back it up with some sort of military or diplomatic or both consequences. So the Mutual Defense Treaty, if it's just a piece of paper, it's a piece of paper. People don't always enforce their agreements. So when the war breaks out in 1914, the question was, and it was going to be answered quickly in the affirmative, will all these different nations go to war? And frankly, it was not much of a question. I read it as is that it was kind of a foregone conclusion that yes, the Germans were spoiling for a fight. The Russians, I think, were spoiling to knock down Germany and knock them a peg off and so forth. The French, I think, are in there as well. I think you've got kind of a bloodlust in Europe in that time period. And I think because you'd had 100 years passed since Napoleon's grand adventures and grand conquering of the continent, there was perhaps a forgetfulness of what a grand or a general European war would look like and how nasty it could possibly be. And that brings us to what brings the war on. And what kicks all those treaties into motion, and in the span of about 6, maybe 7 weeks, you see Europe go from peace to war. So that brings us to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, who is the crown prince of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The crown prince means he is the next in line. He's the next one up. Franz Ferdinand, by all accounts, was a fairly honest man in the sense that he loved his wife. He was not a womanizer. He was not anything of that sort. The fact of the matter is, when it comes to Franz Ferdinand, he and his wife loved each other, had children together, but he was not a loved man by the elites of Austria and Hungary. In fact, actually, it's worth a moment of our time to consider Austria and Hungary. One of the things that is trotted out talked about in schools and in public society today is almost in a sense like you're not supposed to ask any questions about it, is the idea that that diversity in and of itself is a good thing. I dissent. I don't agree. I don't think it's a bad thing, so we're clear. I don't want you running off saying, oh my gosh, he's against diversity. No, I'm not. But at the same time, it is not just simply a prima facie fact that you can say, okay, diversity equals good, equals perhaps a chief good even, meaning is one of the best things you can ever have happen to a country or a place or whatever. Obviously, the United States has benefited from the diverse population and has caused issues we've seen over the years. But I think overall, certainly, it's been a good thing for the United States. We are a melting pot, to use the old phrase. But in the same sense, Austria-Hungary was a diverse nation. They're going to have many languages, many diverse cultures, and many groups that, frankly, at times hate each other. Even the leadership class of Austria-Hungary seems to hate each other. Seemingly, perhaps for the when you talk about Austria-Hungary, the Austrians, who are the top dogs, the top ethnicity in that empire, Franz Joseph, who's the emperor, and Franz Ferdinand, who is the crown prince, they come from the Austrian bloodlines. They run the show, but there's Hungary, and the Hungarians always seemingly quake and chafe under the headship of the state by the Austrians. Let alone the fact that you have Serbians, you're going to have Croatians, you're going to have other Slavs that are in Greater Austria. You're going to have, as I recall once having heard, that approximately about 10 to 20 different languages used in the Austrian army, that you had to give out the orders of the day in multiple languages. Frankly, friends, that's not any way to run a railroad. It's not any way to run an army. And it renders Austria, which was already creaky and wheezy, to be really as fragile as a porcelain doll. Their army was formidable on paper, but it was actually quite vulnerable in the field. It just not function well. And the Germans just don't respect them, particularly as the war drags on. And it's obvious the Austrian army is falling farther and further behind. So anyways, Austria-Hungary has got all these factions in it, and amongst the leadership faction, back to old Franz Ferdinand, he's not loved. And we'll see that when he's assassinated in a few minutes. The assassins of Franz Ferdinand are a group of individuals, well, they're a bunch of kids. I say kids, they're adults. They're doing adult game. They are Slavic nationalists looking, particularly Serbian nationalists, looking to strike a blow for Greater Serbia. Now, the Serbians, and Serbia in that era is a nation unto itself like it is today. Serbia is particularly rabidly hateful of the Austrians. And Austria had launched a war in the early decade, the first decade of the 20th century, and had taken some territory from Serbia. There was kind of a cloak and dagger department within the Serbian army, known collectively as the Black Hand. I call it cloak and dagger, but you can perhaps refer to it, think of it as perhaps a Delta Force, CIA, KGB, whatever you want, but basically black bag operations, assassination, poisonings, and what have you. A group of young men, something about 6, 7 of them, are going to appear in Belgrade and have meetings with the leadership there of the Black Hand, and trying to wriggle out of them a lot of guns and money and butter and all sorts of things so they can go do some assassinations. Well, evidently, from what I've read over the years, and this is the way I read it historically, is that the Black Hand patted them on the head, gave them a handful of guns, and gave them a handful of bombs, but they didn't actually give them anything much more than that. There was kind of like, you go ahead, but we're kind of keeping our distance from you. They didn't completely endorse the whole operation. Well, in late June 1914, the Crown Prince and his wife Sophie are in Sarajevo in what would today be, was it Croatia? No, Bosnia. Excuse me, Bosnia. And they're in Sarajevo, and they are there for 2 reasons. One, to view some Army war games outside of Sarajevo, which had which kind of dovetails into the second one, which is to wave the flag and to let the locals know who's in charge, but to also give them a chance to kiss the ring and show that everything seemingly is in pretty good shape and okay. Well, the locals, Sarajevo's leadership, wanted to play nice and show good. They're not Serbian, they're Bosnian. Wanted to play nice with the Austrian leadership, and they wanted a large crowd to see old Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie pass through the environs there in a beautiful city of Sarajevo. So what these folks did is they set up a parade route along the main river running right through the heart of Bosnia, a river akin to, say, what you get in London or pretty much any major city, Chicago, and so forth. A river runs through a major old city. Well, anyways, it was all well known. What does it do? How to be there? You know, what time is the parade? And when's the passage of the crown prince and so forth? It was all set up and prearranged, and that's the opportunity for these kids, these young men, to strike a blow for Greater Serbia. Nationalism is all involved, and to kill the crown prince and/or his wife. Well, as the parade gets underway and the crown prince's car goes by, the crown prince is going to be, you can't miss him. He's plumed. He looks like a peacock. And as the car goes by, the first assassin who was supposed to set his bomb and throw it at the car as it goes by, he gets cold feet, because it's not an inconsequential thing to go kill the crown prince. He wasn't ready to die, because frankly, as soon as he sets the bomb and throws it, he's a marked man, and he probably is going to have to run and kill himself or try to flee, because the last thing he wants to do is get captured by the Austrians, because they're going to put the screws to him and make him talk. So basically his life is in his hands, and he's trying not, he chickens out at the last minute. Now, the second assassin on the parade route is much made of sterner stuff. He sets his bomb, and it was set in such a manner that you could not miss what it sounded like. It was like the proverbial equivalent of the racking of a shotgun. Ka-chink, ka-chink. Everybody knew it as soon as he set it. He pulled the thing, set the bomb, and threw it. And the bomb hits the car, hits Sophie's and Franz Ferdinand's car, or was knocked away by bodyguards. The reports seem to differ, I've read over the years. But it deflected and blew up under the second car. And oh my, we've missed. We had our opportunity to kill the crown prince, and we missed. Pandemonium in the streets. Franz Ferdinand's car speeds away. Oh my. Well, the assassins that are left, they're running for the hills. The guy who threw the bomb, he runs off, and he runs to the bridge right across the street from the parade route. He grabs a bit of cyanide that he'd had with him, bites down on it, and he throws himself off the bridge, hoping to get killed by not only the bridge, the fall, but also the cyanide. Well, the cyanide was weak, and it burned his throat out, and the fall didn't kill him, so they fished the poor schmuck out, and then they twisted his thumbs and basically got information out of him. Well, anyways, so we have all that taking place. While pandemonium's in the streets, Franz Ferdinand and his driver, they go on to City Hall, and the mayor of this town is so nervous, because you got to remember, unlike us Americans who sometimes have we don't think of our political leaders as our social betters and all that goes with that. Franz Ferdinand was royalty, and the mayor of Sarajevo was not. The mayor of Sarajevo was one of these men who gets really nervous easily. He sweats profusely. What do I do? What do I do? What do I do? And so he just reads this letter. He reads this prepared speech that was supposed to be given with all the bands playing and everybody happy to see Franz Ferdinand. He reads this letter saying, "We love you. We're glad to see you. We're glad you're here, yada, 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 yada." And Franz Ferdinand's temper exploded. And he's like, "Look, you tried to kill me." I mean, he is just eating him alive. Just his temper flared like a pack of hemorrhoids. And the fact of the matter is that Franz Ferdinand, you tried to kill me. What do you think you're doing? And he just chewed this poor guy out. Well, Franz Ferdinand is then going to be taken back to the hospital. He was going to go to the hospital and check on his bodyguards who'd been bombed and had been hurt in this explosion. And so Franz Ferdinand and his driver and Sophie and a couple other bodyguards, they go back, and nobody had thought to tell the driver, change the route. The hospital's a different way. Change your route. Get out of here. Don't do what you were planning to do. That's basic security 101. But one thing I always remember about history, sometimes it's not about some sort of grand design or conspiracy, but it's nothing more than a simple, well, incompetence, the foolish mistake, and so forth. Well, they start to go down the wrong road, back to the old route. And the man sitting in the driver's seat, or excuse me, in the passenger seat next to the driver says to the driver, "Stop the car. We've got to turn around. This is not the way we need to go to the hospital." Well, Franz Ferdinand and Sophie are not going to get out and push the car. The car has no reverse. It's a primitive era. And so the driver and a couple other folks are pushing this heavy old touring royalty car backwards because there is no reverse. And out of the crowd, at the nick of the moment, in the nick of a historical moment, is Gavril Princip. Gavril Princip. Princip. Gavril Princip has the moment of truth thrust into his hands. He has a moment of decision. What do I do? And it's a split-second decision. Here is the crown prince has fallen right back into my lap. We are here to kill him, and this is completely unexpected. What do I do? Gavril Princip reaches in, pulls his pistol out, and goes right up to Sophie and to the crown prince, Franz Ferdinand, and he blasts them both with his pistol, shooting them point blank. And the bullet, as I recall, ripped through one of the bullets ripped through the throat and chest. It's a bloody scene. And the Franz Ferdinand, he basically says, "Sophie, don't die. What about our children? What about our kids?" Very famous line there in 1914. What about our children? Don't die, Sophie. Very touching. And Princip himself was actually dying. He didn't know it at the time, but he had tuberculosis, and he would be dead within a year or two anyway. So it wasn't quite as it wasn't like he was going to live a long life, anyways. The point is, though, is that in late June, I think about June 28th, as I recall, 1914, the Crown Prince of Austria-Hungary dies at the hands of an enemy, Serbia, whom he had fought a war with before. And previously, Austria-Hungary had fought wars before to help unify the nation underneath the headship of the emperor. Austria-Hungary basically laid an ultimatum down on the table. It said to Serbia, surrender, give over land, admit guilt, throw yourself prostrate upon us, and we may provide mercy. And Serbia, too proud, very proud, said, no, go suck a lemon. And when it was all said and done, by the time you get to the first week of August, effectively 6 weeks later, by the time you get to the first week of August, you're going to find Europe plunged into war, a general war that had not happened since the days of Napoleon. All those treaties are all going to be invoked, and they're all going to go to work, and it is going to be a bloody affair. By the way, when Crown Prince and the Crown Prince Franz Ferdinand and his wife Sophie are killed, you would think that Austria, particularly amongst the leadership, would have been mourning. And those who were there in Vienna said there was awful little mourning for the Crown Prince and his wife. But as I said, when we talk about the First World War, it is a bloody affair. Two battles that come out that just stand out for brutality and viciousness in 1916 are the Battle of Verdun, V-E-R-D-U-N, and the Battle of the Somme, which is a river. And Verdun's a fortress, by the way, and the Somme is a river there in northeastern France. Actually, kind of a Belgian territory as well. But the Somme, it's some catastrophic affairs. Arguably, and I think it's actually true, the deadliest battle in the war was early on, 1914, the Battle of the Marne, M-A-R-N-E. But you have all these cataclysmic battles. You have these nasty affairs. In essence, actually, 10 million soldiers. That includes all combatants and some civilians, of course, thrown into. But 10 million men, at least, will lose their lives in World War I. 10 million. Some have seen recently have pushed that up to about 12 or 13 million. Point is, millions of people are about to exit the scene. The First World War is a horribly bloody affair. Why is it bloody? So a lot of it just has to do with the fact that you are in between a period of time where you have tactics that haven't caught up with the weaponry, you have a problem with some logistics, and so forth. When the war breaks out in 1914, the Germans are going to invade not through the common boundary between France and Germany, which was highly fortified and not easily gotten. Germany was going to take what is known as the Schlieffen Plan, named after a late 19th, early 20th century German Field Marshal von Schlieffen. And what it's going to do is going to try to pass through a large German army, is going to try to pass through the Low Countries of Belgium, the Netherlands, and so forth. And what it does is the bet is by the Germans, okay, that violates Dutch and Belgian neutrality, and it perhaps might bring the British into the war. But we Germans bet that we're going to be able to fight this war and fight it and win it quickly out west, so we can then turn our armies around and go back eastward and then crush the slow Cyclops-like Russian army before they can get organized. The Schlieffen Plan was all about timing, surprise, not cloak and dagger, but just simply you've got to be quick and fast. So Schlieffen, in his original plan, called for effectively 90% of his men to pass through Belgium and the Netherlands and the Low Country, violating the neutrality, violating their treaty with Britain, and pass through, catch France by surprise, and attack and sack Paris. Remember this about Paris. If Paris falls, France falls. It probably is true to this day that if Paris falls, France becomes enervated, and it is like the lopping off of a head. So that's the goal of the Germans. Attack, maybe make a feint and a feint assault there in front of the fortifications on the German-French boundary, but send the lion's share of the army marching through and into Belgium and later into Paris. And you do it all by using railroads as much as you can, and then get the boys off and then have them on the double quick march through. The British are going to come up with one of the great propaganda ideas in the war. It's called the Rape of Belgium. That supposedly took place in Belgium, German soldiers raping and accosting men and women left and right. It was the bloody Hun idea. So anyways, you have them passing, that was the idea. However, later on, the Schlieffen Plan will be modified. The two wings of the armies, the German armies, 90% one way, 10 in the other, percentage-wise as far as troops are concerned. We're talking 1 million plus men, by the way. Are going to be balanced out more like 60-40 because Germany was always nervous. The others, whereas Schlieffen was confident France would not attack into Germany, the other German field marshals were not. And so they bolstered that front in front of Verdun and those French fortifications. Well, the German assault in 1914 stalls out right out on the outskirts of Paris. Famously, there were taxi cabs loading folks up, loading men up in France, and literally taking civilians off the streets and taking them to the front to try to stop the German juggernaut, and the Germans were stopped. And so Germany was now caught in what it did not want, and that's part of the reason you have the Schlieffen Plan, because they always didn't want a two-front war. A two-front war because you've got two doors open, your geography is working against you, you've got the open way from Russia to come in, flowing into Germany on the east side. Now you're dealing with France, and it's not good. And by the way, so we're clear, and I didn't say this until just now, is that France and Russia have a mutual defense treaty. Okay? So Germany, by the end of 1914, is stalled out in a stalemate, as are most of the others, and you're going to settle into trench warfare. The war's bloody and nasty on several accounts. The war is nasty and bloody because, as far as the weaponry is concerned, let's put this in notes. The war is most bloody because of the artillery. Artillery is absolutely light years ahead of where it was in the Civil War of America. For example, thousands and frankly millions of shells will be lobbed into various places in the Western Front in World War I. And of course, you're going to have different types of shells, high explosives, bunker busters. You go on down the list. It is a cornucopia of shells and artillery. Approximately 85 to 90% of the casualties of the war are going to be caused by artillery, and it creates some unnerving aspects to the people. Artillery can be conventional, but it also can be, of course, with gas. And artillery can deliver gas. It wasn't at first, but eventually they refined the delivery process. You can send it, and you can drop those gas canisters and have them explode over top of the enemy lines. The poison gas, the chemical weapons that are used, the first one was called chlorine. It was an irritant. It was not very deadly. In fact, it wasn't that debilitating. It would knock you out for, say, a week, but you could get back into the lines. The second common gas used by the Germans and British in World War I, and Americans too, for that matter, and the French, is called phosgene. Now, that was extraordinarily deadly, and some of you are familiar with what your chemistry teacher told you to waft up. You don't stick your nose into a beaker and just snort it up and sniff, sniff, sniff. The fact of the matter is you kind of waft it up. Well, the creator of phosgene wafted his creation up, smelt it, and said, well, it might work. And that night he went to a party, and later that evening after the party, he got sick and died. Just a little bit of phosgene could kill you, but it didn't have sticking power, and that was the problem. You had to really inhale it for it to be particularly deadly. But the one that really rang the bell in the war, in the Great War, is mustard gas. And mustard gas stuck. It lasted. It could last for weeks. You could pick up a helmet that you thought was clean and it had it on there. It could burn your scalp. It could burn through your skin. It could burn through your genitals. It could burn your lungs out. In fact, actually, that was one of the issues for some of the men, is they coughed their lungs up for the rest of the next 20 years. Some men who are burned so badly, they're just they're skeletons and such that they can't die, won't die. And you'll see pictures from the war where men who are laid up underneath tents, and because their skin is so burned that they literally can't have anything touch them, otherwise they scream in agony. Men who are under this constant shelling or regular shelling, that some of them will become debilitated. You saw it in all the armies. And so armies have to develop tricks and practices to help give men time away from the front. And when you talk about World War I, and today we call it post-traumatic stress syndrome disorder, PTSD. In World War II, they called it battle fatigue, and in World War I, it's called shell shock. Shell shock was a real thing, and you'll see men who can't walk, they can't talk, they can't sleep, they talk or they babble incoherently. And then, of course, the issue, too, with artillery, and part of the reason it's so deadly is that if it was explosive, it could rip a man in half. There's a photo in my office, in a book in my office, from the book called Death's Men. You can see this British Tommy. That's the name for they call themselves. This British Tommy looked like two great hands that ripped him apart, just ripped him like you rip open a newspaper, or Hulk Hogan rips open his shirt. But from the face down, half of his face is missing, and it's like so. It's grotesque. Other men, perhaps maybe not killed, but they'll have perhaps half their face shot off or caved in by shrapnel. You'll see the development of masks and such that men will wear for the rest of their lives so they don't look like Harvey Two-Face in Joker and Batman territory. It's grotesque. Men who are hit by it sometimes will be killed. Others, not only will they be killed, some will be, as I just described, just decimated physically, and some will simply disappear. A man will be standing there, and a shell will hit him directly, and he is completely obliterated. There's nothing left except perhaps a helmet and shoes, and maybe not even that. And yet still others, it will look like they're untouched, and the concussive blast of the artillery will shake them so violently it basically causes their brain to rupture, maybe breaks the spinal column or something like that, the brain stem, and they die. It is grotesque stuff. And at the same time, and it's the randomness of it all, it's kind of that idea that I talked about with the Civil War and the problems of faith. Others become religious, others not. But the issue is that you may be where a shell lands and everyone around you gets killed in one form or fashion, yet you're untouched. How does that happen? The second deadliest weapon in the World War is the machine gun. The machine gun, aka the devil's paintbrush, is a really, really good weapon. It is idiot proof. And that was the beauty of it. The prototypical machine gun of the German army and other armies too is called the Maxim machine gun. Now, Americans will use a Browning machine gun, and it'll make an appearance not only in the First World War, but it'll also appear in the Second World War as well early on. But the Maxim machine gun was idiot proof, and that's where I'm really going. You have a squad of 2 or 3. If you know what you're doing, if the Germans figured out the tactics, so did others, but of how to place your machine gun nests, you can't just assault the machine gun straight on, because if you do, it's a bloodbath. It's a bloodbath. The first Maxim machine gun fired at a rate of 666 rounds a minute. That's where it got the nickname Devil's Paintbrush, because that is the mark of the beast in the book of Revelation. And that 666 rounds per minute goes upwards. And you understand this about the Army. You don't have sometimes brilliant men, yet you can take a very simple man, set him behind there, train him, give him basic assistance with another handler, and he can go to work and do some maximum damage. Frontal assaults or standing assaults on machine guns is foolish. And then after that, the causes of death are just simply much, much smaller. Yes, you have rifles. People will use them and use them effectively. Few people die of bayonets. That doesn't really kill that many people. In fact, actually, what kills the most people still in this war too is going to be disease. For all the thousands and millions who die because of weaponry, you still have millions more who die from disease in this war. So disease is a nasty thing. But the life of a soldier in those trenches in the Western Front is grotesque and harsh as well. If you were to be a soldier today, or rather you could go back in time and you had to choose between being a soldier in the British Army, the American Army, or the German Army, aside from obvious patriotic reasons, you would want to be in the German Army, because the German Army seemed to have a better handle on and desire to keep the trenches clean. The German Army is wanting to keep the trenches dry. One of the issues with the American and French and British Army trenches is that they always seemingly had water standing on them, whereas the Germans, they pumped it out. The Germans tried to make it homey. They even had windows and stuff installed. The Americans never so much. The issue also wasn't just the fact it was wet, but you also get what's called trench foot. And perhaps you have had somebody or know somebody who had trench foot. It isn't an unpleasant thing. It's because your foot has been wet day after day, week after week, that when you finally take your shoe off, your skin peels off with a sock. And there it is, and it is a harsh, harsh thing. And soldiers need their shoes, and they need their feet, particularly to march and to walk and to move. So trench foot was a real deal. It was a real problem. Secondly, what was a common companion in those trenches are going to be not just the mud and the water, but also feces and food and rats. Rats, if there was ever a creature in God's creation who said in his way, "Thank you to the Almighty for giving him a bounteous feast," it was the rat. The rats consumed flesh on an industrial scale. And these rats are not little old small field rats that you may have seen running as you mowed a field one day. These are rats that are size of big tomcats. These are the rats that when you fall asleep, they're the ones who might try to bite off a part of your thumb. These are the rats who not only try to do that, they might even eat the food that was in your knapsack. They might have eaten, and in fact, there's a story out of To Conquer Hell. This American doughboy is laid down to sleep. He falls asleep, wakes up, and his corned beef had been eaten by some rats who were crawling over top of him. And then when he woke up, not only did they eat the corned beef, later they consumed the tin can as well. One of the more funny stories is these British Tommies are trying to kill rats, and so they get a hold of a big, tough tomcat, good mouser. and they take this tomcat and they throw him in this officer's quarters that were infiltrated with rats. They let that tomcat loose, and they, all right, he'll get him. The next morning, they opened the door. The tomcat had been consumed by the rats. It was that bad. And by the way, when you build those trenches, you do not build them in a straight line. You build them in a zigzag pattern, perhaps a houndstooth pattern. The idea being is you do not want a straight line because you can shoot down through a trench and becomes deadly. Trenches are designed to save lives. Sometimes they took them because of the unhealthiness and the filthiness. But it is the life of a person on the Western Front, 1914 to 1918, of a soldier is to be in some sort of trench part of his time there on the front. Anyways, when you talk about battles, though, 1916 is the year of battle. The Germans are trying to win the war. They're going to attack Verdun because they realize Verdun means much to the French, and that the French were willing to spend buckets of blood, treasure, tear, and so forth to get Verdun back. Over hundreds of thousands of men will die. In fact, I think it's close to 1,000,001 are going to die in Verdun, in and around Verdun, both German and French. At the same time, in July of 1916, in fact, July 1st, the jump-off date, the British are going to go over the top to try to relieve the French pressure at Verdun and take the battle to the Germans. Prior to July 1st, by about a week, the British will lob over 1 million shells into about a 10-mile distance. That basically is from Bryan to College Station, from the north to the south, or from, say, Caldwell to Tunis, more or less. The fact of the matter is that in that territory, over 1 million high explosives or bunker buster shells are going to be dropped into that area, trying to kill the Germans. And the thinking was that once we go over the top, all I have to do is hold my cane and point the way to Berlin. The Germans will be dead. They weren't. The Germans built better bunkers than the British thought. And on the end of the first day, after they went over the top, 20,000 Brits are going to die on the first day of the Somme. Then, and it's arguable, most of those died in the first hour. The Germans were really good at what they did. The battle rages back and forth, but they don't go very far. Imagine losing 10,000 men for no more than half a mile, maybe a quarter mile worth of movement. It is grotesque, it is bloody, it is bad. And that, by 1917, is what leads the French army into mutiny. The French army is tired of going over the top, attack and die. And the revolutionary fever that was sweeping Mother Russia was also sweeping through France as well. You're going to see a lot of Frenchmen who were interested in the Bolshevik, the communist way. When the order to attack and go over the top is issued in 1917, it was a spring offensive, as I recall, the men don't do it. They mutiny. Many of them rebel. Some just sit in their dugout and say, we're not going. Well, sets the stage of World War I, and now you're ready to have the Americans come in 1917. And that will be the subject of the next video. Thank you.